What's that? I'm going to run the slides myself. I'll do the slides myself. They're right here. That's fine. Now, how do I get that? Good afternoon, everybody. This is a little low for me, so I'm going to pull it up and then I'll put it back down. No, oh, no. So thank you all for coming. I am Dana Shove, the Director of Interpretation here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and welcome to our Saturday speaker series for the month of June, which it seems very hard to believe we're already in June. What started out as sort of a murky day up here has turned out to be nice and warm, so I appreciate you all coming in. This afternoon, we're going to have a fascinating talk by the author of this book, Stephen Goldman, who's standing right here. And allow me, please, to read this introduction of him and his accomplishments. Stephen A. Goldman, MD, is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He is a war historian and the only physician to serve on the Abraham Lincoln Institute Board of Directors. His decades in academic medicine, patient care, and public health, coupled with experience treating and working with those who have been in combat and ongoing in-depth study of American veterans spanning the Civil War today, are exemplified in his groundbreaking book, One More War to Fight, Union Veterans Battle for Equality Through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Lost Cause. Having served as an adjunct assistant professor of psychiatry at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences for many years, he currently teaches seminars as an instructor at the Usher Lifelong Learning Institute at Johns Hopkins University and in the honors program at Shepherd University in West Virginia, of course, as an adjunct professor. And this is his book. He's got a photo of there. We have a number of these downstairs. After Dr. Goldman's talk, there will be a book signing, and we've got it all set up in the lobby. So if you're interested in picking up a copy or chatting a little bit with him, he'll be there. Also, I want to let you know that we have copies of our museum member magazine on the back table. Please feel free to take when you step out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goldman, and we'll hear a fascinating talk.
Thank you, Dana. I gave my first talk for the Museum of Civil War Medicine in 1999 at Shiloh. This is my 13th talk either at this facility for the Museum of Civil War Medicine or one of its other facilities. I will have number 14 in November at the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum during Veterans Day weekend, which you'll hear more about. I usually like to start my talks with a unifying quote, and given it's been 26 years, I had to quote Robert Hunter. What a long, strange trip it's been. It's also been a wonderful trip, and the trip is not over. Matter of fact, the trip in some ways has just gotten started. Bear in mind, in 1999, 9/11 hadn't occurred. There was no Iraq and Afghanistan war. And it is remarkable what has changed in 26 years. It is fascinating that the first talk I gave was on the psychological impact of combat. And I realized the tremendous knowledge we've gained in the 26 years. Among the Union veterans I'll be discussing today is First Sergeant Robert Penn, 5th United States Colored Troops of the Left Arm Corps, which I'll explain, and one of the first African Americans to be awarded the Medal of Honor. I have 3 special guests who have not arrived yet, but I do want to introduce in absentia, as they come, Ms. Linda W. Banton and Ms. Marsha Malone, two of Robert Pinn's great-great-granddaughters, and Ms. Shannon Holland, great-great-great-granddaughter. There is a fourth descendant, Linda's son Brooks, who is not here, who is a great-great-grandson, and the four of them are the newest members of our family. Speaking of family, I want to dedicate this talk to my father-in-law, Alan L. Struzand Alvala Hashem, who landed 81 years ago yesterday on Utah Beach as a sergeant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Fought his way off the beach, strung wire and equipment behind Nazi lines, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and was a concentration camp liberator as a first-generation American Jew, and was awarded the Bronze Star. My father-in-law, and the men I'm going to be talking about today, the ones who preceded them and the ones who followed them, the men and women who served in that, exemplify the service to this country that has been done by citizen soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and obviously always need to be celebrated. What I'm going to talk about is maybe different than what you've heard before.
Can I just move this a little closer to you?
How's that?
A little bit.
How's that?
I think that's better. Thank you.
Can I put it a little further up though, so I'm not hunched over?
Yeah,
How's that?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay. In a September 24th, 1864 letter, a hospitalized soldier from the Army of the Potomac embodied those who had put their lives on the line for Union since 1861 and for African American freedom after the release of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. The men of the Union were disgusted by the Democrats' peace at any price presidential platform, which deemed the experiment of war a failure. And this soldier, anonymous, wondered if the Copperheads, quote, were foolish enough to underestimate their intelligence and understanding of events. When free men rise in arms to defend free institutions, what thinking could be more true, more wise, more patriotic than ours? It is thinking bayonets that compose our army, and it's because they are in the grasp of thinking men, they gather their majesty and power. Most all who have died, die for nothing. It is remarkable when you take a look at the people who followed them. I just finished rewatching Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's magnificent Vietnam War documentary. If you thought it was good in 2017, it's even better now. And this could be a Vietnam vet talking about dying for what the deception was. What did the men of the Union do, knowing full well that it meant more carnage, more lives lost? What did they do? They voted overwhelmingly to re-elect Abraham Lincoln. A tremendous renunciation of the Democratic candidate, who was, of course, George McClellan, the former actually General-in-Chief and Commander of the Army of the Potomac. 6 months after they re-elect President Lincoln, the Confederate States of America no longer exist. Slavery has forever ended with the combination of Northern victory, the earlier passage of the 13th Amendment, and its later ratification. We always hope, because war exerts such a tremendous price in human and economics, we hope that the war's end signifies the end of the causes for which they fought. That's rarely the case. And certainly the Civil War was no exception, because the United States faced unparalleled circumstances in almost every direction. Already reeling from the first president ever to be assassinated and the staggering numbers of war dead, there were hundreds of thousands of men, wounded veterans who needed care with no system. Bear in mind, no VA. The GI Bill was 80 years away, and the pension system was embryonic. At the same time, millions of African Americans were newly free. The linked issues of Reconstruction, race, sectionalism, and the conflict's legacy had to be confronted. And what took place would not only greatly affect that critical era in American history, which remains poorly understood and frankly poorly taught in many of the schools, have profound repercussions that continue to this day. In One More Water Fight, I tell two intertwined, previously untold stories from the unique standpoint of Union veterans, white and black. How they fought a second war seeking equality for all Americans, and thus created a model of civic commitment based on military service that U.S. citizen soldiers, sailors, and Marines have emulated in their lives. My take on history is different, quite frankly, than most of the classic academic historians do. I am not an academically trained historian. My fields are medicine, psychiatry, epidemiology, and war. I take a different take. One of the reasons why I wrote this book was because this isn't working. There was no book written from the perspective on Reconstruction for the men of the Union. It's written by the okay. As they fix this. What you don't read in other books on Reconstruction is the political activism of the Union veterans, which I'm going to talk about. You don't read about what they did in the decades to follow. Even the great book that Eric Foner wrote, America's Unfinished Revolution, Eric's book ends in 1876, when Reconstruction ended. My book ends, I believe, in 1913 and 14, because there were decades that would follow the end of Reconstruction. Now, my work utilizes a rare lifelong study of a group of Union soldiers and a few sailors, almost all of them white, who in the war's wake, that is from mid-1865 to early 1866, 268 battle-hardened veterans, 98% of whom enrolled as enlisted men, that lost the use of their right arms in combat, responded to a nationwide competition designed to encourage them to train their left arm, their uninjured hand, for clerical occupations. They were asked for writing samples, handwriting samples. What they submitted were essays of astounding literary merit on all but one aspect of their war experience. Anyone want to take a guess what the one thing they didn't write about? The great taboo that soldiers had to talk about until recently. What do soldiers do in battles? They kill. Yeah, they didn't talk about this. So one thing they didn't talk about. Amassing demographic data on all these men, which took me a decade to do, when I told Dr. John Sellers, may he rest in peace, my very close friend who was the curator of the Civil War and Reconstruction papers at the Library of Congress, who got this all started in addition to my wife taking me on Civil War trips. He said, no one's done this before, and I would call him and say, there's a reason why no one's done this, because this takes forever, which it did. What I used was the William Olin Bourne papers at the Library of Congress, where these essays came from. I also used the pension and military records at the National Archives, because all these men were disabled. The great advantage, frankly, I had with the pension records is they're medical records. That's a tremendous advantage. I have to tell you a quick funny story. The first time I looked at the pension records, I called my brother, who's also a physician, surgeon, oncologic surgeon, who served 20 years in the military, with this gentleman sitting in the front row, our friend Eric Israel. And I called my brother, I said, you're not going to believe this. The forms they're using are the same forms you and I use at the VA. And they're exactly the dermatome forms. I'm convinced someone bought like hundreds of thousands of these forms, and I was really thrilled to see that. So why did I do this? Because I needed to know if this group was representative of the average white Northern volunteer. They are extremely representative of the average soldier. So this is epidemiologically based. This has been invaluable to the ongoing work I do on the multifaceted, life-altering effects of combat and military service on veterans and their society itself. Now, even though this is a validated sample of white Union veterans, there were 2 African-American members of the Left Arm Corps, both of them from the same regiment, the 50th United States Colored Troops. Both of them free men of Ohio. One is Robert A. Penn, who I mentioned. If they show, hopefully, their 3 descendants are here, and William Hannibal Thomas. In addition to the Left Arm Corps itself, I've studied a tremendous number of both white and African-American ex-servicemen, both solely as a group. Now, justifiably proud of their own capabilities as men of war, white Northern soldiers showed great appreciation for what black troops had undergone just to serve in the armies of the Union. Don't forget, unequal pay, almost no chance to get commissions, serving exclusively under white officers, and in the beginning, given no chance to fight, given menial jobs, all of which changed during the war. And their tremendous skill, persistence, and valor when finally given the chance to fight. As I detail in One More Water Fight, this well-earned respect that African-American men got for the first time from white men had a tremendous impact on Reconstruction, as you can imagine. Now, what was significant and different about the Civil War? American veterans had returned home before, but never in numbers such as they did. In fact, they dwarfed the numbers of previous wars, like the Revolutionary War. And of all the previous war combined, there had never been such a marked proportion of men with debilitating injuries. The impact of the mini ball being absolutely destructive to bone. These men were green young volunteers who had left home to see the elephant, that marvelous expression about going to war. But they came home as professionals who had witnessed sights and performed deeds, positive and negative, that they never could have imagined and persevered. Marine First Lieutenant, screenwriter, and Vietnam veteran William Burroughs Jr. You can come back from war broken in mind or body, or not come back at all. But if you come back whole, you bring with you the knowledge that you have explored regions of your soul that in most men will always remain hidden or uncharted. Marine Corporal Eugene Sledge, veteran of the Pacific Theater of World War II, who wrote 2 of the finest books ever written. Have people read Sledge's books? They're amazing, aren't they? They're the basis for, if people think Band of Brothers was good, watch The Pacific, which is an incredible documentary. And they're based on, obviously, including Bob Lecky's books and John Basilon's life. But Sledge's book in particular, that last episode, is remarkable. Close combat had changed those of us who endured it. We were just plain different from other people through no fault of our own. We saw life through a different lens and always would. Knowing what they had to put behind them, at the same time, Union veterans demonstrated remarkable perception. And this new concept, new in terms of being termed a concept, but not new in terms of history, post-traumatic growth, that was grounded in accomplishment. Private William McLeod, 104th New York. The mental discipline, expanded liberal views, now held of life and its surroundings, but above all, the self-knowledge acquired, enlarged intellects, and the influence they exert on society are ample reparations for the inconvenience suffered for the loss of an arm or a leg. I think I speak knowingly because I left an arm on a Virginia soil. Ideological resolution and resoluteness bound Northern veterans. Because of all Americans, they knew what lay ahead, and that the, quote, unfinished work that Lincoln talked about in the Gettysburg Address promised to be as bitter, divisive, and as perilous as the war itself, about more so. But let me make a point about the unfinished work in the Gettysburg Address. What was the unfinished work Lincoln was talking about in the Gettysburg Address? Anybody? Freedom. He was talking about African-American freedom. The unfinished work after the Civil War ended was not freedom. It was equality. And as Bruce Catton memorably wrote in the early 1960s, the men of the Union started something which we ourselves have got to finish, and continues. So these men returned from war, as men and women returned from all wars, irrevocably changed. It is not surprising that a sizable proportion of the Union citizen servicemen have been politically radicalized. We've seen this from war and war again. But the question that I started with was, would white and black Northern veterans maintain the dedication to the causes for which they had battled and bled, and continue the struggle for freedom and opportunity for all Americans. And with the special barrier-shattering brotherhood that forms among those who risk their lives together continue in the absence of war. No one had answered that question before, quite frankly. Certainly not in the way that I looked at it. Based on my in-depth research spanning Reconstruction and the ensuing decades, my answer is unequivocally yes. That's what this book is all about. Despite permanent physical damage that would complicate almost every aspect of their lives, don't forget, the Left Arm Corps lost use of their right arms. Does anyone know what doorknobs did in the 1860s? Which way did they turn? They turned to the right. Anyone who was left-handed, there were no left-handed scissors. Had people change their handwriting in schools. Left, because left is associated with the devil. And so it was bad enough they lost use of an arm, it had to be their right arms, their dominant arms. But they weren't defeated. They weren't defeated by being forced to leave the military service due to their disability or when the terms of enlistment were completed. Ladies and gentlemen, the Robert Pinn family. Yes, and we'll be talking with you later. Welcome. On the contrary, these men were still soldiers and sailors, like their able-bodied fellow survivors. And in fact, what had happened with them was just beginning, because they were going to expand upon the results of the Civil War. I have lost the use of my right arm in this bloody war, and I would freely have sacrificed my life for home, for law, for right, for Constitution, for freedom, for government, for humanity. Private Ora D. Woolbridge, 104th Illinois, September 11th, 1865. Remember, these men were asked for a handwriting sample. This is what they turned in. And by the way, these were men who were not highly educated in terms of postgraduate or college. These men were from common schools. In the same vein, and you came at a very opportune time, as you'll see in a minute, Black veterans' awareness that recognition of their distinguished service was critical to the fight for full citizenship was personified by the two African-American members of the Left Arm Corps. Hopefully this will work now. Starting with this man. When Fort Sumter was fired upon, Robert Pinn of Maslin, Ohio, glad they got it right, I was very eager to become a soldier in order to prove by my feeble efforts the black man's rights to untraveled manhood. I read this essay, and I told Dr. Sellers, I'm going to curate this collection because I want to find out about this man and his comrades. And that's how this all started. But he was denied admission to the ranks of the Loyalists on account of my color not being of that kind, which is considered a standard in this country. The young farmer finally got his chance in 1863, and he became an exceptional soldier who received the nation's highest military decoration, as you can see, one of the first African Americans to be awarded the Medal of Honor. As for Hannibal Thomas, who was also in the 5th USCT, he made an eloquent plea for fairness on September 27, 1865. We ask no favors on our own behalf, but we ask if such devotion, that is, their service in the military, is not a test of loyalty. And since the evidence is so conclusive and we have shared alike in the dangers and vicissitudes of the war, ought we not to partake of all the immunities pertaining to the rights of citizens, even as our white brother, what say you? This is a plea from a man who'd gone to war and lost the use of his right arm. Nobody asked the Left Arm Corps for their opinions on the explosive issue of equality. All they asked for was a handwriting sample. Yet these men, on their own, white Northern veterans, emphatically showed that they had exactly the same concerns as these two men of color. Spontaneously and independently expressed concerns for African Americans throughout the entire duration of this handwriting contest. They exhibited a group insight into the challenges of Reconstruction, commitment to justice for those who are newly free, a powerful warrior identity, which I'll talk about, and a deep comprehension of the vital work to follow. That's Hannibal Thomas, who became later known as Black Judas for a notorious book he wrote in 1901, which you'll find fascinating, and I think that's chapter 9 of the book. He's the only man who could have gotten W.B. Du Bois and to agree on anything. They both couldn't stand William Hannibal Thomas because of what he wrote about. Booker T. Washington. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington agreed on this man when they didn't agree basically on anything else. And the books all came out at almost the same time in 1901. So hopefully when you have the book, you'll see how fascinating that was. This is Ezra Hiltz. The questions of Reconstruction, free suffrage, punishment of rebel leaders, we trust will be considered from high and just standpoints, that no act may be committed by those in authority not in strict accordance with the best human judgment and the immutable laws of justice and of mercy. These were men made in a society that looked at people who were disabled as having transgressed morally, who they felt if they were given aid, it would somehow enable their disability. They were facing all this. Look at what they're writing about, how important their war service has been. And then in answer to Thomas's question, one day before he actually posed it, was 121st New York Private Rufus Robinson. We cannot be true to the principles of republicanism while we say to the colored man, you have no rights at the ballot box that we are bound to respect. You know where he got that from? He got that from at the time, perhaps the worst decision made by the Supreme Court, that say to him, take the musket, gain your freedom, not till universal suffrage becomes a law will our country stand forth in all the greatness and grandeur, united, disenthralled, and redeemed. There were others. Autumn 1865, Private Henry Crowell, 13th U.S. Infantry. Are we to suppose that 4 million of men made free by the results of a gigantic war in which they themselves have borne no small part will be satisfied with anything short of entire citizenship, with all its consequent rights? What better security can there be for the future peace, loyalty, and prosperity of the South than this just measure of universal suffrage? Universal suffrage being for men, don't forget. Women were not voting. And by the way, as we know, or perhaps I should reiterate, citizenship, which came with the 14th Amendment, did not include two very important groups. It did not include, astoundingly, Native Americans, nor did it include Asian Americans. If you're not familiar with possibly the most racist piece of legislation ever passed by U.S. Congress was the Chinese Exclusion Act, keeping Asians out of the United States and giving them no citizenship until the 20th century. So yet again, these men who had fought, now bear in mind, there were segregated units, whether they were state regiments that remained state regiments like the Massachusetts 54th, or those that were incorporated into the United States Colored Troops. By the way, the 5th USAT that Robert Pinn and William Hannibal Thomas had joined was originally the 127th Ohio. By the way, all free men of color. Decidedly second-class citizens in Ohio, but nonetheless free men of color. They became the 5th USCT. But there were certain states, particularly Connecticut, Iowa, and Massachusetts, that did keep all black units as state regiments. Now, they remained segregated units, but they fought alongside white soldiers. So, and don't forget, the Navy was integrated from the beginning. There was a quota in the Navy, but the Navy was integrated. And so those are things we need to realize. Then in December 1865, William DeCamp, a physician, by the way, who does not go to war as a physician, nor does he go to war as an officer. I've never been able to find out why this man entered the Union Army as a private and not as a physician. He eventually did get his commission. And bear in mind, yet again, ask for a handwriting sample. He writes an entire amazing essay about race in the United States in 1865. Although the intermarriage of white and blacks is not in accordance with my taste, and I esteem it my privilege to discourage the same by the mild agency of remonstrance and argument, yet strictly speaking, if a white man chooses to marry a black woman, or the reverse, it is simply none of my business. Nor is it any other man's business, so long as they behave peaceably, quietly, in violation of no law, and do not intrude themselves upon the sanctities of other people's homes or residences. This was 1865, not 1965. So you have a Maine Union officer ask for a handwriting sample, declaring that racial intermarriage, though not to his preference, should be permissible. This only predates the loving Supreme Court decision by more than 100 years. And then he sums up with something that should really ring a bell to what was famously delivered 98 years later at the Lincoln Memorial. And this is what he writes and underlines: taking the teachings of Christ, for if common sense justice is our guide, the black man should be judged as all other classes of men are judged, namely upon their merits, without regard to color. This is why, I'm sure you'll understand, when I read these, I said to John Sellers, who, by the way, they were thinking of destroying the collection because it wasn't being used. John, of course, knew exactly what I was going to say. He enlisted me to come up from New Jersey to do this, and that's how this all started. We basically saved the collection because this collection is gold, and I can still continue to utilize it. There was another submission, which, by the way, was not an official essay, by this man, Henry Allen, from the Massachusetts 1st Cavalry. He writes separately a scathing poem about Andrew Johnson's veto of the Freedmen's Bureau bill, which we're going to talk about. And he says, "Tell me, comrades, true and loyal, have our sufferings been in vain? Must the Union yet be severed, with our flag be rent in twain? Must the freedmen still be bonded in wicked, hellish chains?" Making the clear point that freedom wasn't enough. As we know, that's exactly the case. He was hardly alone in this. He was driven by a remarkable concept that I'm writing and talking about more and more, called survivor obligation. You've heard of survivor guilt. But survivor guilt generally morphs into something deeper and frankly magnificent, that survivor obligation, which I'll talk about. Having treated, worked with, and studied veterans from modern conflicts, I draw upon both a psychiatrist and a war historian's grasp of how they've been inspired by both the gift of survival and the powerful warrior identity to change their society for the better. Here's an example. Every day is extra is an expression of gratitude for survival where others did not make it. It is a pledge accepting the responsibility to live a life of purpose. And it's the recognition that we had better live our extra days in ways that keep touch with the memory of brothers whose days were tragically cut short. Anyone know who wrote that? I'll give you a hint. Congressman, senator, secretary, vice president, presidential candidate, climate representative, an amazing head of hair, John Kerry. And of course, I remember, as so many of you I'm sure do, that lantern-jawed man in his naval uniform testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, famously asking, how can you ask a man to be the last one to die for his sake? He was one of the founders of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And for Kerry, and for others, the gift of survival motivated what he did, what he's done in service to this country. And obviously there were others. Since the beginning of history, men have gone to war. They kept the experience at the forefront of their memory. Dr. Samuel Bradshaw, Carol Bioldi, and James B. Horn of the Topeka, Kansas VA. We'll be talking about their research findings a little bit later. That memory and the legacy of those who go to war, the warrior identity, incorporates the full panoply of war, which 130th New York Private Edward M. Jennings, who lost his right forearm and vision in his right eye to a rebel shell, described in his prize-winning essay that he submitted as all the elements of sublimity and terror. You've got to look at war in its entirety, because there's soldier's pride and there's a warrior identity. Michael Mangan, who left Ireland in 1854, goes to Wisconsin, and he enlists in the 6th Wisconsin, as you know, an integral part of the famed Iron Brigade. He's been commissioned a second lieutenant when he and his regiment, commanded by Rufus Dawes, who wrote arguably the finest memoir of SE. It's an amazing volume of any Union. It actually is one of the amazing volumes, period, of an American citizen soldier. He did not receive the 2 medals of honor he should have received, but he was brevetted as a brigadier general. Mangan is serving, literally standing next to Rufus Dawes at the railroad cut, first day Gettysburg, and he gets shot in his right ankle, and his leg is amputated, his lower leg. He's promoted to a first lieutenant, Mangan. He's discharged in 1864, and he joins the Veteran Reserve Corps as second lieutenant. I'll talk about the Veteran Reserve Corps. 5 months later, he identifies himself as a member of, quote, 1st Regiment, 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Army Corps of what I believe the best army in the world, the Army of the Potomac. Typifying this soldier's pride is 6th Pennsylvania Cavalryman Louis J. Booz, a dentist who went to war in November 1861 as a private. They weren't looking for dentists, apparently, in the medical group, so he goes to war as a private. He turns out to be a superb soldier. He re-enlisted as a veteran volunteer on New Year's Day, 64. Within 4 months, he loses his right forearm at Todd's Tavern, Virginia, and he's discharged in November 1864. And this is what he writes about his experiences in battle. I firmly believe that military discipline will improve a young man, will give him the experience of hardships, problems, and sufferings which he would hardly meet with in the life outside of the Army. It teaches him not to be troubled about what were previously heavy grievances. 4 years later, his feelings hadn't changed. As a soldier called upon to give a history of my experience while in the Army, I do so with feelings of pride and wonder at the many trials through which I have passed, and which have enabled me through God's blessing to bear the crosses of this life upon coming home to live as a private citizen. Across time, what he observed matches what psychologists Carol M. Aldwin, Michael R. Levinson, and Abraham Spiral III's seminal study of 1994 of the vulnerability and resilience in mainly World War II and Korean War veterans, 40% of whom had seen battle. They found positive aspects of veterans' time in service decidedly outweigh the negative, as 90% or more, including those with the greatest exposure to combat, endorsed no fewer than 11 desirable effects. They included positive feelings about self, becoming more independent, a broader perspective, and a clearer sense of direction and purpose, and valuing life more. I'll give you a movie example of that, from a troubling film that I didn't like in some ways and others. Who here has seen The Deer Hunter? The titular Deer Hunter, played brilliantly by Robert De Niro. If you remember the film, actually, with other great actors, including Christopher Walken, who won the Academy Award, and John Savage. The only one who comes back from the war, allegedly unscathed, is Michael, the deer hunter. Do you remember what he does when he comes home, what he's been dreaming about? He goes hunting. What happens when he goes hunting? He can't. He sights on the buck, and he doesn't pull the trigger. I have heard this story from men I've treated. And it's not being anti-hunting. It's because having seen so much destruction and death, for those men and women who go through war, life becomes more precious than ever. Which is antithetical, by the way, to one of the biggest stereotypes about veterans, is that they're dangerous, that they're more prone to violence when they return. The evidence shows exactly the opposite in relation to that. And one of the things I point out in my book is what I've learned from the men and women I've worked with, and the tremendous generosity about bringing me into a fraternity that frankly they don't bring many people into, because they're frankly concerned about what people are going to think if they talk about things like this. But they want me to talk about it and to validate, which is one of the reasons why I'm here, which is one of the reasons why I write these books. So that when they looked at this data, they concluded that apparently combat exposure inoculates some men against future stress. In comparison to that trauma, daily stressors were insignificant. Sounds just like booze. That's exactly what he had said like 80 years before. Other men spoke of their battlefield promotions and their pride in discovering they could successfully command and protect other men. They felt if they could cope with war, they could cope with anything. We see this time and time again. Your great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-grandfather is emblematic of someone who turned that experience to becoming a teacher, becoming an attorney, the other men he served with, white and black, what they did with their lives, which is what I show in One More Water Fight, is using their experience, using what they learned to teach to others in civilian society what they had learned in the cauldron that is still felt to be the most challenging of all, surviving war. And contrary to some historians who still don't see it that way, and the general public beliefs, a group of psychologists and sociologists, Glenn Elder, analyzed prior longitudinal studies of World War II and Korean War veterans, reporting in 2018 that in every study, at least half said that military service was a turning point, an experience that changed the direction and quality of their life. Reflecting the duality of war, they noted it could be a double-edged sword at best and the worst. Which leads me to Bradshaw, Horn, and Oldie, two psychiatrists, one psychologist, who wrote about the warrior identity, a paper that came out in 1991, which was an epiphany for me. I've never met Sam Bradshaw, but we've spoken on the phone. I read his article when I was working for the VA in Massachusetts and working with Vietnam vets, and I called Dr. Bradshaw because they wrote this amazing paper about the warrior identity, which I was seeing with the men I was working with. And they talk about the spectrum of response to going to war. And at one end is what they call the heart of darkness killer, at one end of the spectrum, which is rare. While at the other end are those who have no personality adjustment at all. Where do you think most of the people are? They're in the middle. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean the warrior personality only develops in the middle. It's all along the spectrum. And what are the virtues? Courage, the ability to withstand delayed gratification, and intense comradeship found throughout the spectrum. Now, these are obviously very beneficial in non-military pursuits. The sustaining force and power of the warrior identity is evident. Such studies, and my own unprecedented examination of Union veterans' political activism and embrace of societal commitment that was intimately linked to the military service, are indicative of marked post-traumatic growth that are manifested by those who have been to war. So what kinds of things did this obligation promote among not just the Left Arm Corps, but all the majority of Union veterans? Outstanding service in the Freedmen's Bureau, which I will talk about briefly, but it is in detail in the book. Bitter opposition to the wrong man in the wrong place in the wrong time. Andrew Johnson. Someone has suggested to me recently, and I had to think about this, you're not giving Johnson credit. I said, tell me what I'm not doing. They said, if he hadn't been such a miserable president, Reconstruction would not have gone on the way it did. As I said, I hadn't thought about that. They're absolutely right. And I know what they were after. Congress ran Reconstruction and actually did it as ably as they could, more so than Johnson was able to do. It's a small saving grace, but I do point that out. Battling the Ku Klux Klan and its atrocities, and I'll mention that towards the end of the talk, and the Grand Army of the Republic, which I'll also mention briefly, forming the most stalwart bloc of support for landmark Republican initiatives on behalf of African Americans and fighting bigotry and racism in two particular areas on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Let's not forget this amazing state that many of us live in is below the Mason-Dixon line. And this was a border state that had slavery. It's also the only border state that abolished slavery on its own in 1864, in a remarkable story, which is a separate lecture that I do. The Freedmen's Bureau. The full name, Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, but it's called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was only to exist for 1 year. Think about that, 1 year. And was run through what department? It was purely a military operation. Therefore, it had no money other than the defense appropriations. Now, the one who was chosen to be the commissioner was Oliver Howard, who also had lost use of one arm, which he had lost in battle. He was Lincoln's choice. And to his credit, I do like to give credit when credit is due, Andrew Johnson stuck with Lincoln's choice. And he did continue with Oliver Howard, Major General Oliver Howard, commander of the 11th Corps in the Army of the Potomac, as the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. And it was a good choice. And I love W.B. Du Bois's comment that any man might well have hesitated to take on such work with the vast responsibilities, indefinite powers, and limited resources. Probably no one but a soldier would have answered such a call. Then the great sociologist says, indeed, no one but a soldier could have been called because there was no money appropriated for salaries and expenses, which is absolutely true. The Freedmen's Bureau, a remarkable organization. And by the way, there was a Freedmen's Bureau in Maryland. There was a Freedmen's Bureau in 2 counties in West Virginia. It was not just, and also included D.C. and parts of Delaware. It was not just the former Confederate states. I do want to point that out. And what happened was that they became the de facto government in the former Confederate states. That was done through that. Now, they were having problems with manpower for the Freedmen's Bureau. Don't forget, a military operation. And in the beginning, they were basically drafting people in the Freedmen's Bureau whether they wanted to be in the Freedmen's Bureau or not. They got wise to this fairly quickly, and they start to tap a remarkable source of manpower that no one had anticipated, the Veteran Reserve Corps. Who here has heard of the Veteran Reserve Corps? Okay, and you're in the right museum for it, certainly. Famously initially called the Invalid Corps. Again, another talk I do about that. The worst name possible, a year later became the Veteran Reserve Corps. The Veteran Reserve Corps were under different enlistment and commissions. There were people who stayed in the Veteran Reserve Corps, in the military service, for one reason only, to serve in the Freedmen's Bureau. I'll give you examples of that. And it was daunting what they were asked to do. They were asked to put together an economic system of free labor. Don't forget, there were millions of African Americans who'd worked on plantations, now were going to be paid. Never been paid before, for the most part. So all these things, enforce contracts, be sure they were protected legally. And the Freedmen's Bureau was there to do that with various degrees of success. The crowning achievement of the Freedmen's Bureau were the Freedom Schools. And remarkable work that was done, predominantly using what now would be called NGOs, were church-based organizations sending teachers to Freedmen's schools, predominantly from New England, by the way, and being protected by the members of the Veteran Reserve Corps. So this was an ace in the hole that no one had anticipated. So that as time went on, you had remarkable people, including, by the way, 7 members of the Left Arm Corps. 7 members of a group of 286 men served in the Freedmen's Bureau. 4 of them as Veteran Reserve Corps officers, another 3 in new regular Army regiments, composed almost exclusively of men who had been maimed. And there was another additional 8th man whom knew born when he was at Central Park Hospital. They all did exemplary work, which I do detail in the book. I'm going to focus on 2 people in particular as I start to draw it to a close. Unfortunately, I can't show you his picture because I don't have the rights to it, but it's in the book. And that is Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, 45th U.S. Regiment Captain Joseph Wiley Gelway. Personally assigned by Oliver Howard to investigate the Klan in Tennessee. Who was in Tennessee at the time? The Grand Wizard himself, who had slaughtered surrendered black troops and their officers at Fort Pillow, Nathan Bedford Forrest. So here's Gelway, one-armed, lost at Gettysburg, brought in to essentially investigate the Klan, and his work was remarkable, under threat of death, by the way. This is a man who survived some of the worst battles in American history, and talking about being more frightened walking the streets in Tennessee. Second man is this thing. Okay. I just have one more if you can.
Okay.
If you get that. That, ladies and gentlemen, is William Augustus McNulty, who had to fight his way into the Veteran Reserve Corps. He was a top sergeant. He'd lost his arm. He spent a year trying to convince him that a man with one arm belonged in the Veteran Reserve Corps. Another story that I tell. Hey, you can't make this stuff up. He, in his essay and in his letter to Bourne for the collection, talks about why he's in the Freedmen's Bureau. Because he's already in Fauquier County as a sub assistant superintendent of the district there. He does such amazing work, which again I detail, that when he's discharged from the Veteran Reserve Corps on January 1st, 1868, he is simultaneously appointed personally by Oliver Howard as a civilian to continue in the Freedmen's Bureau, which he does until 1870. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I want to leave plenty of time for questions. All these factors are compelling with respect to the concept of moral injury. And when we consider how veterans view themselves and reintegrate into society, the great psychiatric researcher and writer, Dr. Jonathan Shea, has asked, is betrayal simply one of the many terrible things that happen in war? Based on his work with Vietnam veterans, he reported the strong belief, quote, that moral injury is an essential part of any combat trauma that leads to psychological injury, unquote. Following this, Dr. Shea said that those who have been to war are generally able to recuperate, quote, from horror, fear, and grief once they return to civilian life, so long as what's right has also not been violated. What I have found in researching the Left Arm Corps, Union soldiers and sailors overall, and veterans throughout history, is that moral injury, PTSD, and suicide risk are all connected, which is consistent with my colleague, Dr. Shea's formulation. In light of the Left Arm Corps' lack of combat-related PTSD, because I've assessed all of them, general post-war psychological well-being, and the stated views I presented here and in my writings, it appears that this cohort, highly representative of Union soldiers and sailors, did not manifest moral injury in relation to the military service. Why? Because like their black and white Union brothers, they fought a war involving highly moral, ideologically based objectives with thinking bayonets in uniform, remaining thinking bayonets in peace. Their mental health is highly consistent with the rich, expanding psychiatric, post-traumatic growth in military literatures, and what has been painstakingly learned and relearned about war and veterans since 1865. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Grand Army, and I want to open it up to questions. The Grand Army of the Republic, still the most influential and powerful single war veterans organization, was founded in 1866. And their mission was to maintain in civilian life those great principles for which it stood in arms of their national flag, to vindicate everywhere and at all times the full and complete rights of every loyal American citizen against all combinations of force or fraud that may attempt to deny or deprive them of such rights. They were concerned about being called partisan, so they became an apolitically official organization, but where they stood on Reconstruction, equality, and Republican initiatives couldn't have been clearer. Now, how representative was the Grand Army? The zenith of the organization was in the 1880s and 90s, with its membership peaking in 1890 at over 400,000 at over 7,000 local posts. Fully half of all Union veterans, that's 1.3 million men, were members of the Grand Army at any time in their lives. That is highly representative. The Left Arm Corps, 57%. And just like the vast members of the Grand Army, they were almost exclusively progressive Republicans, which they remained throughout their entire lives. Therefore, they are typical of what I perceive to have been the findings in the post-war and among Union veterans. I will conclude with this point that I would make, that in 1880, Anselm Smith, yet another member of the Left Arm Corps, was a party stalwart in New York. and there was an election, presidential election coming up, reminding their fellows that their work was not done in 1865, but it continued through 3 successful political campaigns, crowned with the affirmative suffrage of the nation, the 15th Amendment, African American males getting the vote. 1,000 generals of the Union Army could not palliate nor annul the terrors and bloodshed with which the Democratic Party has unionized and again sets in the field a solid South against the patriarchal volunteers of the peace-loving North. The struggle is again upon us. It's our country that calls. Again, political activism following what they fought for in uniform. The Grand Army, and I have an entire chapter on this in the book, in its finest hour, with the whole nation watching, steadfastly and proudly refused to draw a color line in 1891, the only national organization to do so in 19th century America. 5 years later, what does the Supreme Court decide? Plessy versus Ferguson, setting back the cause of racial equality for decades to come. I will end here. I thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Dr.
Please.
Is there an equivalent to the GAR among the Confederate veterans? Or was there?
I facetiously could say the Klan, which I'm not being that facetious. One of the things, and again, when I try and tell the story of war, and I try and tell the complete story, including betrayal, including people who forgot what they had fought for. The blue and gray associations come into existence, and suddenly African American veterans are no longer part of decorating graves in preference for Confederate veterans. An absolute betrayal of their Union comrades. Yes, they're the sons of the Confederacy, daughters of the Confederacy, they were organizations. They did not have the political power nationally that the Grand Army did for decades because there were so many Republican, don't forget there were 5 Union generals, former Union veterans. The last who was assassinated was McKinley, who was a Union veteran, who were presidents. So the influence wasn't the same. On the other hand, which I make abundantly clear in One More War to Fight, people forgot in the North, and they never forgot in the South. And what took hold and continues to have an influence, I make it crystal clear in the book, is a lost cause interpretation to the Civil War, which also incorporates that interpretation to Reconstruction. Remember the tragic era and what people call, Eric Foner's book was a revelation. And by the way, I don't talk about Reconstruction failing. I talk about Reconstruction ending because the federal laws were still on the books. And one of the things I point out in the book, which frankly other people hadn't, even Eric didn't even mention that, because again, he stopped in 1876. I point out how the laws passed during Reconstruction, the federal laws, were utilized in northern states such as Ohio, Kansas, Illinois, to desegregate schools, because those laws were federal. So the reach of the Grand Army was not replicated in that sense by Confederate organizations. On the other hand, as time went on, the Confederate organizations and the lost cause started to, and as the Union veterans were dying out, it really started to turn. That's a great question. Yes?
Yes, Dr. Goldman. Again, thank you for all you do. I respect so much your discipline that you brought to this additional field that you study, so additional fields for the world. So what would you say in your research as you started for this particular book? Were there any surprises? What would you consider to be, you're sitting in your study late at night and you said, oh my God, I didn't know that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Linda Banton and Marsha and Linda Banton's over there, yes. The 3, and of course, Shannon Holland. That's a marvelous question. I was stunned that other people hadn't picked up on this. That's number one. I was stunned by other historians well before me claiming that Union veterans had no interest in Reconstruction, that were blaming white Northern veterans for a lost cause interpretation of the war, when I was finding exactly the opposite. And it wasn't like I was finding things that weren't there. They were out there. That was one thing I was stunned by. I did find, I remember, Kit can tell you this, when I found out, the first two chapters are about the soldier conventions of the midterm election of 1866 and the presidential election of 1868, of Union soldier conventions that were completely in response to conservative soldier conventions supporting Andrew Johnson, which were turning out 30,000 people, for example, in Pittsburgh. No one had written about this. I'm still amazed. I was delighted that I was the one who found it. But I said, how could they possibly have missed that? And, you know, I'll be honest with you, Marsha, I think it's because I've worked with veterans. I've seen the political activism of Vietnam veterans and Vote Vets now. It's a different viewpoint. I thought it was extremely important, and it was sustained. The other things that horrified me were the betrayals of what happened in the 1890s and at the turn of the century, turning away African Americans at grave decorating ceremonies, for example, in South Carolina, in preference for former Confederate soldiers. I'm not in any way talking about making war on other veterans, but how can you turn your back? And by the way, some of the white soldiers who did that had commanded African American troops. I found that shocking. So that's a great question. On the other hand, I found what I didn't understand why Civil War historian after Civil War historian said that they were not politically active. When I had worked with Vietnam veterans and other veterans, I said, why would the men of the Union fighting an ideologically based war like no one had ever fought before since, wouldn't be politically active? It didn't take long to find out that they, frankly, were wrong, that there was tremendous evidence. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question from online
Oh, sure.
about whether in your research you found anything about racial integration in the GAR and veterans.
Yeah, I have, again, I can't, forgive me, I keep pointing to the book because I do like 5 lectures. Actually, I do lectures on every chapter. This is a compilation of all of them. There was tremendous integration within the Grand Army. I mean, the entire chapter I have, and by the way, Robert Pinn becomes the junior vice commander of the Department of Ohio. And I read the actual transcripts. I found everything about him, as you know. I found the actual transcripts of when he was elected the junior vice commander. And it's remarkable the respect that he had. Again, I made the point that the Grand Army Republic was the only national organization, including churches, that were fully integrated. And when they refused to draw a color line in 1891, I wasn't exaggerating, the whole country was watching this. And when they refused to draw a color line, in defiance of particularly posts in the department in Louisiana, knowing that other white veterans would leave because they would insist on not having a separate unit for black soldiers, they stood fast. And if that didn't send a message to the rest of the United States, I don't know what does. They didn't rise to any level above junior vice commander in a State Department. Pinn was one of the ones who got as far as that. But Robert Pinn, after he was the junior vice commander, became a member of the National Council, along with a former president of the United States. They traveled together. So, as you know, he was remarkable. But he wasn't remarkable in that sense in terms of the Grand Army. Having said that, there was still racism within that. But bear in mind something else, to be fair to the Grand Army. 90% of the men who were veterans were white. Only 10% were African American. So the membership was disproportionately bad. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Next question. Please. No other questions? You must have a question. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I have so many questions.
I'm not going anywhere.
My name is Dean Schmiel. I'm one of those Civil War historians.
Hope I didn't offend you.
Talk about. And I'm working on a book. I did a self-published book called Civil War in Statuary Hall. Statuary Hall, as you know, is 100 men, a few men, represented in which Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, Joe Wheeler, and others, stalwarts of the Confederacy, are honored. That's the right word, honored,
Yes.
in our nation's capital.
My last chapter is about that, you know that.
I didn't know what to find out. Which was one of the functions of the fact that despite all the efforts of your groups, the overwhelming change in the dialogue was because of people like the United Daughters of the Confederacy changing their textbooks and other groups. In 1896, William McKinley said, of course we could have Confederates buried in Arlington Cemetery, beginning that. These people were the exception, a glorious exception of the exception. And I'm sorry, it's a long one.
Is there a question? Is there a question coming?
One of the representative people who's honored in Statuary Hall is Edward Douglas White. Born in 1845 in Louisiana at a sugar plantation for his father. Joined the Confederate Army, was a guerrilla, prisoner of war, joined the Klan, United States Senate, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the majority votes in Plessy versus Ferguson. 1855, Louisiana honors him by making him one of their 1955. In 1954, Plessy versus Ferguson had effectively been reversed. Bomb versus Education. One of the speakers at dedication of White's statue was the Chief Justice.
Earl Warren.
Earl Warren, who said, without blushing, he was a proud fighter for the Confederacy. He did it.
If I may.
And he established a strong constitutional order. This is quoting Earl Warren.
Okay. Let me.
So the question is, it's a long essay.
Okay. All right. First of all, my last two chapters incorporate McKinley. The entire last chapter is about the Lee statue ending up in Statuary Hall for over 100 years. It's all about that, and the fact the Grand Army betrayed itself and made itself irrelevant by never passing a resolution protesting the presence of Robert E. Lee in Statuary Hall.
We have
Yes.
to talk about.
But it's all, I've looked at that. When you take a look at films, including Shane, by the way, one of my favorite films, there was a decided lost cause aspect to that. I mean, one of the most egregious, obviously, is Gone with the Wind. You know, the prologue that they start with that. And, well, the worst is Birth of a Nation. But you see that in a lot of films of the era, as you're pointing out. That does not start to change for even decades after that. And you see that presentation. Take a look at some of the presentation about in the early 60s, when things start to turn. And one of the things I would point out, the fact remains there are still many more books about the Confederacy than there are about the Union. The presentation of Union soldiers and again, a lot of it comes from two great books, Bellow and Wiley books, The Life of Billy Yank and The Life of Johnny Reb. But Bellow and Wiley talks about the machine-like efficiency of the Union soldier. He talks about the poetry and the magic of the Confederate soldier. There's a lot of poetry and magic in those Union soldiers. And what I'm pointing out, by looking at essays of common soldiers, listen to what they wrote and how they wrote and what they're writing about. And what I'm trying to do, and I think with some success, and I'll continue to do it with other books I'm trying to get done. I have a Civil War book that's actually the precursor to One More War to Fight, is changing the narrative. And you don't change the narrative necessarily by bashing everything else. You tell it by telling the story straight. And one of the things I do want to point out, that in a nation racked with racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism during those times, not everybody felt that way. Not everyone used the N-word. And the greatest change in attitude during the Civil War was the attitude of white Northern soldiers towards African Americans. And that took place over 4 years. There is no doubt that Lincoln's election wouldn't have been as strongly supported if there hadn't been radicalization of the Union, which is what I point out. And I think that's an important message. And the fact that it was maintained, again, you know, the question that you asked, Marsh, is a great question about what I found and what I didn't find. It was the sustained belief for decades of what they were fighting for, that it didn't go away. Again, different than what people were saying in terms of that. But I looked at everything, and I tried to include that. So in summary to what you're saying, there's still a lot of work about how this history is portrayed on both ends of the spectrum. And I think it's very important to tell, I mean, you're not going to tell history with all its imperfections, and you're not telling history straight. Can I take any more questions, or is this?
Well, I know that there might be some folks that want to purchase your book.
Oh, yeah, well, if you're going to ask me that, I'd be delighted. That would be terrific.
Questions there.
This was wonderful. Thanks for coming on a gorgeous day.
Melissa, would you, I don't want to rush anyone out, but would you want to facilitate getting things going downstairs at the table?